Hi, I'm Emily. I'll be your storyteller today. Many of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Also, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable. Close your eyes and let the sound of the rain guide you into the story. I chose the cabin on Blackwood Lake for one reason: the silence. As a writer, my greatest commodity and my most elusive resource is a profound, uninterrupted quiet. My city apartment, with its noisy neighbors and the constant siren song of the streets, had become a prison of distraction. I needed to escape, to find a place where the only sounds were the ones I typed onto the page. The advertisement for the winter rental promised absolute peace, and it did not lie. The silence here is a physical presence. The cabin is a small, rustic A-frame, nestled in a thick grove of pine trees at the edge of the water. In the summer, I imagine this place is bustling with boaters and swimmers. But now, in the dead of a deep northern winter, it is a world of white and gray. The lake, a vast 3-mile expanse of water, is frozen solid. A solid sheet of ice a foot thick. It is a sterile, beautiful, and utterly empty plain, a perfect mirror for the pale winter sky above. My life here has fallen into a simple monastic routine. I wake with the weak morning light, brew a pot of strong coffee, and write for 8 hours straight. My only companions are the flickering screen of my laptop and the occasional brave chickadee at the bird feeder outside my window. The sense of isolation is total. The nearest town is 20 miles away, and the single dirt road leading to the cabin is barely passable. I am an island in a sea of snow and ice. This solitude, which might drive others mad, is a balm to my soul. It allows me to finally hear my own thoughts, to untangle the threads of the novel I have been struggling with for years. The silence is not an emptiness, it is a canvas. Against its perfect white backdrop, the words come more easily, the characters feel more real. I feel a sense of profound productivity and peace that has long eluded me in the noisy, demanding world I left behind. The cabin itself is my fortress against the cold. It's old, built of dark, fragrant cedar logs, with a large stone fireplace that has become the heart of my small world. At night, I build a roaring fire, the crackle and pop of the burning logs the only sound for miles. I sit in a worn leather armchair, a wool blanket over my legs, and read, the firelight dancing on the pages. It is a simple, almost primitive existence, and I have never felt more content. The frozen lake is my front yard. I spend hours just staring out at it through the large picture window in the living room. It is a landscape of profound stillness. Sometimes the wind will whip a fine layer of snow across its surface, creating shifting, ghostly patterns. But mostly, it just sits there, a solid, unmoving expanse of white. It is a symbol of the season, of a world put on pause, frozen in a state of deep, quiet hibernation. The sounds of winter here are subtle and quiet. The sigh of the wind through the pine trees, the soft percussive tap of a branch against the roof, the occasional distant crack of a tree limb surrendering to the cold. These are natural, organic sounds, the gentle breathing of the wilderness around me. They are sounds that deepen the silence rather than break it. A quiet, natural symphony that I have come to cherish. I feel utterly and completely safe here. The harshness of the winter is my greatest protector. No one would venture out this far without a good reason. The thick ice on the lake is a barrier, the deep snow on the land a deterrent. My isolation is my security system. I have left the locks and alarms of the city behind and in their place, I have the vast, silent, and impenetrable fortress of the northern winter. My days are measured by the shifting light and the slow consumption of my firewood pile. I have enough supplies to last me for months. I have no need for the outside world. My phone gets a weak, one-bar signal, enough for a brief text message, but not for the endless distraction of the internet. This forced disconnection is a blessing, a key part of the quiet I came here to find. I am here to work. I am here to be alone. This, then, is my world. A woman, a cabin, a frozen lake. A life reduced to its simplest, most essential elements. Writing, reading, and the quiet contemplation of a silent white landscape. I have found my peace, my focus. I have built a perfect, quiet life in the heart of the winter. I am blissfully unaware that the silence I treasure so much is not empty. It is simply holding its breath, waiting for a sound to rise from a place where no sound should be. The nights are the most profound part of the experience. The darkness here is absolute, untainted by the light pollution of the city. On clear nights, the sky is a breathtaking canopy of stars, more than I have ever seen in my life. The Milky Way is a vivid, shimmering slash across the blackness. The sheer scale of the universe is a humbling, awe-inspiring sight, and it makes my own small worries, my own fictional worlds, feel beautifully insignificant. I have never felt so small, and yet so connected to something so vast. I've learned to read the personality of the ice. On brutally cold nights, it will make sharp, percussive cracking sounds, like a gunshot in the dark, as it expands and contracts. At first the sound was alarming, but I quickly grew accustomed to it. It is the sound of the lake breathing, of its immense power contained beneath a frozen skin. These are the natural, explainable noises of my new home, and I have learned to differentiate them from anything else. My novel is flourishing in this environment. The characters, who had been stubborn and silent in the city, are now speaking to me, their stories unfolding with a new clarity. The silence has given them the space they needed to come to life. I write with a feverish intensity, the words flowing more freely than they have in years. This cabin is not just a home. It is a creative incubator, a place where my work can finally thrive, nurtured by the profound, generative quiet. I sometimes take short walks along the edge of the lake, my boots crunching on the packed snow. The air is so cold it feels sharp in my lungs, a clean, purifying sensation. I follow the tracks of deer and rabbits, the only other signs of life in this frozen world. It is a landscape of beautiful desolation. I am the only human for miles around, a single warm-blooded creature in a world of white, silent cold. The solitude is exhilarating. My friends from the city think I am crazy. They call, their voices tinny and distant on my weak phone signal, and ask if I'm lonely or scared. I try to explain the profound peace of the place, but I know they can't understand it. To them, silence is an absence, a void to be filled with noise and distraction. They cannot comprehend that for me, the silence is a presence, a rich and textured thing that is full of its own quiet power. I have everything I need here. A well-stocked pantry, a massive pile of firewood, and an endless supply of the silence that fuels my work. I have no desire to leave, no need for the diversions of the world I left behind. I have found a rhythm that is dictated by the sun and the needs of my own creative process, not by the clocks and schedules of society. This is the purest form of freedom I have ever known. My sense of safety is tied to the ice. As long as the lake is frozen, the world feels sealed, shut down, paused. The thick, solid barrier of the ice is a physical representation of my own isolation. It separates me from the complexities of the world, a great white wall between my sanctuary and everything else. I find myself hoping for a long, cold winter, for the ice to remain thick and strong for as long as possible. Before bed each night, I have one last ritual. I step out onto the small back porch, which overlooks the lake, and I listen. I listen to the wind, to the distant creak of the trees, to the profound, deep silence of the frozen water. It is a way of taking the pulse of the night, of reassuring myself that all is as it should be. The silence is always there to greet me, a faithful, unchanging companion. I have found my perfect, quiet corner of the world, a place where my work can flourish and my mind can finally be still. I am a writer who has found her ideal environment, a solitary soul who has found her perfect solitude. The world has been simplified to the essential elements of fire, wood, ink, and ice. There is nothing here to fear. The silence is my shield. But the ice, which I see as a barrier, is also a veil. It hides a world that is deep, dark, and utterly unknown. The silence, which I cherish as a source of peace, is also a perfect medium for the quietest, most impossible sounds to travel. I am about to learn that my sanctuary has a basement, a deep, dark, watery cellar, and that something in that cellar is about to start knocking on the floorboards beneath my feet. The first time I heard the sound, I had been at the cabin for nearly a month. The novelty had worn off, replaced by a deep, abiding sense of peace. I was fully immersed in my new life, my new routine. The silence had become my closest companion. It was a particularly cold, still night. There was no wind, no creaking branches, not even the sharp crack of the ice. The world outside my window was holding its breath, wrapped in a blanket of absolute, profound quiet. I was sitting in my leather armchair, reading by the light of the fire, the flames casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. It was late, well after midnight. It was in this perfect, unbroken silence that the sound began. It was a low, resonant thump, a deep, percussive sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the cabin. It was not loud, but it was deep, a sound that felt as if it came from the center of the earth. After a few seconds of silence, it came again. Thump. It was rhythmic, slow, deliberate. My first thought was that it was some kind of distant construction, a pile driver working late into the night. But the nearest town was 20 miles away. There was no way I could hear something like that from this distance, especially not with such a deep, resonant clarity. The sound was clean, pure, not muffled by distance. I put my book down and walked to the large picture window, peering out into the darkness. The moon was a bright, cold disk in the sky, illuminating the vast, empty expanse of the frozen lake. Everything was still. There were no lights, no signs of activity anywhere on the horizon. And yet, the sound continued its slow, steady beat. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from the direction of the lake. My rational mind immediately began to search for an explanation. It had to be the ice. Despite the lack of the usual sharp cracking sounds, perhaps this was a different kind of pressure release. A deeper, slower shift in the massive sheet of ice. Or maybe it was a geological phenomenon, a seismic tremor too small to be felt, but just large enough to be heard. It was strange, but it had to be natural. It had to be. The sound was unlike any natural sound I had ever heard. It was not the random, chaotic cracking of ice. It was perfectly metronomic, a slow, steady heartbeat in the dead of winter. Thump. A pause of about 10 seconds. Thump. Another pause. Thump. The regularity was what made it so unsettling. Nature is rarely so precise, so patient. This felt like something else. This felt intentional. I stood at the window for nearly half an hour listening. The sound never wavered in its rhythm or its intensity. It seemed to be coming from the far side of the lake, a deep, resonant pulse emanating from a single stationary point across the vast, frozen expanse. It was a deeply lonely sound, a single rhythmic voice calling out in a silent, sleeping world. I felt a strange, inexplicable sense of dread creep over me. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that rushed back in was profound, but it was no longer peaceful. It was an empty silence, a void where the rhythmic thumping had been. The absence of the sound was now as unsettling as its presence had been. I stood there for another 10 minutes, waiting, listening, but the sound did not return. The night was once again completely quiet. I tried to shake it off, to dismiss it as a strange atmospheric anomaly. The way sound travels over frozen water in the dead of winter can be strange and deceptive. It was probably something mundane, its sound distorted and amplified by the unique conditions of the night. It was the only logical explanation. I returned to the fire, but I couldn't focus on my book anymore. The memory of that slow, rhythmic thumping echoed in my mind. That night, I dreamt of a great dark heart beating slowly at the bottom of the frozen lake, its rhythm shaking the foundations of my small cabin. I woke up several times, my own heart pounding in my chest, my ears straining against the quiet of the room. I told myself it was foolish. It was a sound, nothing more. A strange, natural sound that I had never heard before. There was nothing to be afraid of. But I knew, with a certainty I couldn't explain, that I would be listening for it again the next night. The next morning, the bright, unforgiving winter sun did its best to dispel the fears of the night. In the daylight, my anxieties felt foolish, overblown. The frozen lake was just a lake, a beautiful, static expanse of white. The idea that a simple sound could have terrified me so much seemed absurd. I was a solitary woman in an isolated cabin. It was only natural that my imagination would play tricks on me in the deep, profound silence of the night. I was determined to forget it. I forced myself to stick to my routine, to find comfort in the familiar. I wrote for my allotted 8 hours, my fingers flying across the keyboard, building worlds of words to keep the memory of the sound at bay. I chopped wood for the fire, the physical exertion a welcome distraction. I was actively trying to convince myself that what I had heard was a fluke, a single strange note in an otherwise peaceful symphony. I would not let it disrupt my hard-won peace. But as evening fell, and the cabin was once again plunged into darkness, the familiar sense of dread began to creep back in. The silence no longer felt like a peaceful canvas. It felt like a listening ear, waiting. I built a larger fire than usual, as if the extra light and crackling sound could somehow ward off the deep, resonant thumping I feared was coming. I was subconsciously building my defenses against a threat I was consciously trying to deny. And of course, it came again. A little after 2:30 in the morning, the slow, steady heartbeat started its performance from across the lake. Thump, thump, thump. It was identical to the night before. The same rhythm, the same deep timbre, the same unnerving patience. My rationalizations about atmospheric tricks and distant construction now felt like flimsy, pathetic lies I had told myself. This was a real, recurring event. This time, I didn't just listen from the window. I bundled myself in my heaviest coat, pulled on my boots, and stepped out onto the back porch. The cold was a physical shock, a sharp intake of air that burned my lungs. But I needed to hear it without the filter of glass and wood. Out here, the sound was clearer, more defined. It was definitively coming from the frozen lake, a pulse from beneath the ice, vibrating up through the frozen ground beneath my feet. I stood on that porch for an hour, a lone, shivering figure in the vast, cold darkness. The sound continued its metronomic rhythm, a steady, indifferent pulse that had no regard for my presence, for my fear. It was the sound of something ancient and tireless, performing a task whose purpose was a complete and terrifying mystery. I felt an overwhelming sense of my own insignificance in the face of it. I was a fleeting, temporary guest in a place with very old, very strange secrets. The third night, its return was no longer a surprise. It was an expectation. I was waiting for it, my logbook open, my pen ready. The sound had become a part of my reality, a new horrifying addition to the natural sounds of the winter. At 2:41 a.m. it began. I noted the time. I noted its character. I was no longer just a listener. I was a chronicler of the phenomenon, documenting its every beat. My scientific detachment was a thin veneer over a growing mountain of fear. There was no logical explanation left. This was not the ice. This was not a machine. This was something else. Something that was happening every night, in the same location, with the same rhythm, from a place where nothing should be happening at all. The very impossibility of it was what was so terrifying. It was a direct contradiction of the laws of the world as I knew them. After an hour, it stopped, just as it always did. I was left in the silence, my mind racing. Who or what could create such a sound, and why? What was the purpose of this slow, rhythmic beating from beneath a solid sheet of ice in the middle of a frozen lake? The questions were unanswerable, and that was the true horror. I was faced with an event that had no logical cause, no rational explanation. My peaceful sanctuary was now irrevocably tainted. The silence I had once cherished was now just the space between the thumping. The frozen lake, my beautiful white canvas, was now a veil, a thin, frozen skin hiding a monstrous, rhythmic secret. The first phase of the haunting was over. I had heard the sound. I had accepted its reality. And now, I was about to learn that it was not content to stay on the far side of the lake. It was coming for me. My nights were no longer my own. They belonged to the sound. I would write during the day, my focus fractured, my mind constantly drifting to the frozen lake and the secret it held. Then, as darkness fell, my real work would begin. I would sit by the large picture window, my logbook open, a pair of powerful binoculars on the table beside me. I was no longer just a writer. I was a watchman, a lonely sentinel guarding against a threat I could not see or understand. The thumping continued its faithful, nightly rhythm. It was a constant in my life now, as predictable as the rising of the moon. I learned its nuances, the slight variations in its resonance depending on the temperature, the way it seemed to be absorbed by a fresh snowfall. I documented everything with a detached clinical precision, a defense mechanism against the overwhelming fear. If I could treat it like a scientific phenomenon, perhaps I could keep the terror at bay. For a full week, the sound remained stationary, always emanating from the same spot on the far side of the lake. It was a fixed point of horror. While its existence was terrifying, its consistency was, in a strange way, a small comfort. It was a known variable. It had its place, and its place was far away from me. I knew where the monster lived, and it lived on the other side of a vast, 3-mile expanse of solid ice. Then, one night, something changed. I was at my usual post by the window when the thumping began. But it was different. It was subtly, almost imperceptibly louder, more resonant. It felt closer. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the dark, moonlit expanse of the far shore, searching for any sign, any light, any explanation for the change. But there was nothing. Just the familiar, still landscape of snow and trees. At first, I told myself, it was just my imagination, my heightened state of fear playing tricks on my perception. Or perhaps it was the acoustics of the night, the air denser, carrying the sound more efficiently. I made a note of the change in my logbook, but I tried to dismiss it, to file it under unconfirmed variants. But the feeling of wrongness, the sense of its increased proximity, was a cold knot in my stomach. The next night, the change was undeniable. The sound was no longer coming from the far side of the lake at all. It had moved. It was now clearly emanating from what I judged to be the center of the lake, a full 1.5 miles closer to my cabin. It was the same slow, rhythmic, deliberate thump, 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 but its location had shifted dramatically. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was not stationary. It was mobile. The realization was a new and profound kind of terror. The sound was not just a strange, localized event. It was a presence that was capable of moving, of traversing the vast frozen expanse of the lake with a slow, deliberate purpose. And its direction of travel was unmistakable. It was moving towards me. Each night, it was claiming another stretch of frozen water, closing the distance to my shore, to my cabin, to me. My scientific detachment shattered, replaced by a raw, primal fear. I was being hunted, not by a creature of the woods, but by a sound, a thing that could move with impunity under a solid sheet of ice. The lake, my beautiful, silent, frozen barrier, was not a shield. It was a highway, and something was using it to slowly, patiently, and relentlessly make its way to my home. I spent the rest of the night pacing my small cabin, my mind a whirlwind of terror. What was it? A submarine? The thought was absurd. A geological fissure, somehow moving under the lake bed. Even more unlikely. Every logical explanation I could conjure was more ridiculous than the last. I was left with only the terrifying, impossible truth. Something was moving under the ice, and it was coming for me. My cabin, my fortress of solitude, now felt like a trap. It was a tiny, fragile outpost on the edge of a vast, hostile territory. I was no longer just observing a mystery. I was the destination. The thumping sound was the slow, steady footstep of a predator, and I was the prey it had been stalking, night after night, from across the frozen water, and it was getting closer with every beat. The following nights confirmed my terror. Each night, the thumping would begin, and each night, it was demonstrably closer. I started making a map in my logbook, drawing a rough outline of the lake and marking the sound's perceived location each night with a small dated X. The series of X's formed a horrifyingly straight line, a slow, deliberate arrow pointing directly at my small cabin on the shore. The data was undeniable. My private horror now had a trajectory. My days were now consumed by the lake. I would spend hours by the window, my binoculars pressed to my eyes, scanning the vast white expanse of the ice. I was searching for anything out of the ordinary, a crack, a fissure, a dark shape beneath the surface. But there was nothing. The ice was a flawless, impenetrable shield, its surface smooth and white, betraying none of the secrets of the dark, rhythmic heart that beat beneath it. The feeling of powerlessness was suffocating. The threat was moving in a world that was completely inaccessible to me. It was like being stalked by a creature that could walk through walls. I was confined to the land, while it had free reign of the entire 3-mile expanse of the deep. Dark, frozen water. I could only watch the surface and wait. I was a lighthouse keeper, watching a storm gather that only I could see. My writing came to a complete standstill. The fictional worlds I had been building seemed trivial, childish, compared to the real-life horror that was unfolding outside my window. How could I write about imaginary monsters when a real, impossible one was slowly, patiently making its way towards my front door? My sanctuary of creativity had become a prison of fear, and the silence I had so cherished was now a source of constant, unending terror. After a week of its steady approach, the sound was now in my half of the lake. It was no longer a distant, deep rumble. It was a clear, proximate thump, a sound that seemed to make the very air in my cabin vibrate. I no longer needed to strain to hear it. It was a guest in my home now, an unwanted presence that filled my nights with its steady, monotonous, and terrifying rhythm. I began to have vivid, waking nightmares. I would imagine the ice cracking open, and a great dark shape hauling itself out of the frigid water. I would imagine the wet, non-human footprints on my porch that you mentioned. I would imagine a face at my window, its features pale and distorted by the freezing water. My own mind was turning against me, providing a horrifying visual narrative for the auditory terror I was experiencing. Then came the final night of its journey. I knew it was the final night. The sound began, and it was not just close. It was here. It was emanating from a point just off the small wooden dock at the edge of my property. It was so close that I could feel the thumping through the soles of my feet as I stood on my porch. The vibrations traveled from the ice, through the frozen ground, and up into the very foundations of the cabin. I stood on the porch for hours, my flashlight beam cutting a useless path across the ice, revealing nothing but a smooth, unbroken surface. The sound was happening right there, just 50 feet away. A loud, clear, and powerful thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of something demanding entry. It was the sound of knuckles knocking on the underside of the world, and it was knocking right at my door. My terror was absolute. There was nowhere left for it to go. It had crossed the entire lake. It had arrived. The journey was over. I was no longer waiting for it to get closer. I was now waiting for what it would do next, now that it was here. The feeling was one of impending, inevitable violation. The hunter had cornered its prey, and it was now just sitting outside my door, its slow, patient heartbeat a promise of the horror to come. I finally retreated inside, barricading the back door with a heavy armchair. A gesture I knew was utterly futile. I huddled in my living room, as far from the lake-facing windows as I could get, and I listened. The thumping continued for another hour, a relentless, possessive rhythm, before finally, mercifully, stopping. The silence that followed was the most terrifying of all. It was the silence of arrival, and I had no idea what the morning would bring. I did not sleep. I spent the night huddled in my armchair, the fire long since dead, my wool blanket pulled up to my chin. I was a statue of fear, my ears straining against the silence, waiting for the sound of splintering wood, of a window breaking, of the thumping starting again from right beneath my feet. But the silence held until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the windows, painting the room in pale, ghostly shades. The arrival had been silent, and so was its aftermath. For hours, I refused to look outside. I was too afraid of what I might see, or perhaps what I might not see. The fear of the unknown was a paralyzing force. I made coffee with trembling hands, the simple, familiar ritual a stark contrast to the profound, terrifying mystery that was waiting for me just outside my door. The cabin, my sanctuary, felt like a cage, and I was terrified to look at the monster that was rattling its bars. But I knew I couldn't hide forever. The sun was fully up now, its weak winter light glinting off the vast, white expanse of the lake. I had to know. I had to see what the daylight would reveal. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I forced myself to walk to the large picture window that overlooked the lake. I stood back at first, peering at the familiar scene from a distance, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Everything looked normal. The snow on the shore was undisturbed. The pine trees stood as silent, dark sentinels. The surface of the lake was a flawless, unbroken sheet of white, just as it had been every other morning. A wave of dizzying relief washed over me. Had I imagined it? Had the proximity of the sound finally caused me to have an auditory hallucination? Was it all just in my head? I felt a surge of foolish, desperate hope. But then my eyes drifted towards my small wooden dock, and my hope died a sudden, violent death. There, in the ice, just a few feet from the end of the dock, was a hole. It was not a jagged crack or a fissure. It was a perfect, dark, and utterly impossible circle of open water in the foot-thick ice. The water within it was black as ink, and a thin, ethereal mist was rising from it into the frigid morning air, like a foul, slow breath. I stared, my mind unable to comprehend what I was seeing. A hole. A perfect circle of thawed, black water in a lake that was frozen solid. The temperature outside was well below zero. Nothing could have melted the ice like that. Not with such precision, such perfect geometry. It was as if someone had taken a giant drill and bored a hole directly from the dark, watery depths up into my world. I scrambled for my binoculars, my hands shaking so badly I could barely focus them. I raised them to my eyes, twisting the dial until the image snapped into sharp, terrifying clarity. The edges of the hole were smooth, almost cauterized. The water within was still, a black, unblinking eye staring up at the sky. There was no sign of what had made it. There was only the hole itself, a profound and terrifying violation of the natural order. It was proof. It was the undeniable physical manifestation of the presence I had been listening to for weeks. The thumping, the moving, the waiting. It had all been leading to this. This was the exit wound. Something had been trapped under the ice, and now it had broken through. It had emerged from a place where no living thing should be able to survive. let alone create a perfect circular door for itself. My scientific, rational mind was a distant, screaming voice, trying to find an explanation. A geothermal vent? A meteorite? But I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and as hard as the ice itself, that this was not a natural phenomenon. This was the work of the entity, the thing that had crossed the entire lake, its slow, rhythmic thumping the sound of its patient, tireless work to break free. And it had chosen to break free right at my doorstep. I lowered the binoculars, my breath misting in the cold air of the cabin. I felt a sense of awe that was almost religious in its intensity, an awe that was indistinguishable from pure terror. I was witnessing something impossible, something that defied all the laws of nature and physics. The barrier between my world and its world had been breached, and as my eyes scanned the snow-covered ground between the hole in my cabin, I saw the next impossible thing: the footprints. Leading from the edge of the impossible hole was a line of dark, wet prints in the pristine white snow. They were not the tracks of a deer or a bear or any animal I could identify. They were large, long, and oddly shaped, with no discernible toes, almost like the impression left by a heavy, wet sack being dragged and placed, one after another. They were deeply unsettling in their alien configuration, and they were heading directly towards my cabin. I followed the line of prints with my binoculars, my heart pounding a sick, frantic rhythm. The wet, dark shapes stood out starkly against the snow, a clear, deliberate path. They led from the hole, across the 50 feet of frozen shore, and directly to the small wooden staircase that led up to my back porch. The thing from under the ice had not just emerged. It had come ashore. It had come for a visit. My terror was so absolute, so profound, that it almost became a strange, out-of-body calm. I was watching a scene from a nightmare, but it was happening right outside my window in the bright, clear light of day. The prints were methodical, evenly spaced. They spoke of a slow, deliberate purpose, the same patience I had heard in the nightly thumping. This was not a panicked, wild creature. This was something with intent. The line of wet, dark footprints ended at the bottom of my porch stairs, but a series of wet patches, dark against the frosted wood of the steps, continued up onto the porch itself. It had climbed the stairs. It had stood on my porch, just a few feet from the glass door of my living room. It had been right there, separated from me only by a thin pane of glass and a flimsy lock. The thought made me feel faint. And then came the most terrifying detail of all. The wet tracks stopped at the edge of my porch railing. They just ended. There were no tracks leading away. There were no prints leading back down the stairs or off the side of the porch into the snow. The trail led from the impossible hole in the ice, up my stairs, onto my porch, and then it simply vanished into thin air. It had come, but it had not left. My mind reeled, trying to comprehend the logistics of its disappearance. Had it climbed onto the roof? Had it clung to the side of the cabin? Or had it simply dissolved, a creature of water and ice that could not long survive in the dry winter air? The lack of an exit was more terrifying than the arrival itself. It meant the creature was either still here, hiding somewhere I couldn't see, or it was something that did not obey the simple physical laws of coming and going. I scrambled away from the window, my back pressing against the far wall of the cabin. My home, my fortress, was no longer safe. It had been breached. The perimeter was compromised. The entity had proven that a foot of solid ice was no barrier to it. and the 50 feet of land between the lake and my cabin was a distance it could cross with ease. I was no longer isolated from the threat. The threat was on my porch. I ran through the small cabin, frantically checking the locks on all the windows and doors, my actions fueled by a surge of pure, primal adrenaline. I peered out of the small kitchen window, then the bedroom window, my eyes scanning the perimeter of the cabin, searching for any sign of movement, for any dark shape half hidden among the pine trees. But there was nothing. Only the snow, the trees, and the silent, watching hole in the ice. The first part of my ordeal was over. The subtle signs, the distant sounds, the creeping dread, they had all culminated in this single, undeniable moment of physical proof. The creature from under the ice was real. It was intelligent, and it had now paid me a visit. The question of, what is the sound, had been answered with a far more terrifying question. What is the thing that made the footprints? I huddled in the center of my living room, as far from the windows as possible, my eyes darting back and forth. The silence of the cabin was no longer peaceful. It was the tense, waiting silence of a home that has just been invaded. I was trapped, a lone survivor in an outpost that had just been overrun. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that the thing from the lake would be back. The visit was just the beginning. My mind, after the initial paralyzing shock, shifted into a state of frantic, survival-driven clarity. The terror was a wildfire in my veins, but it was also a source of pure, focused energy. I had proof. The footprints. The hole in the ice. This was no longer just a sound or a feeling. It was a physical event, a tangible piece of evidence. I had to document it. I grabbed my phone, my fingers slipping on the screen as I opened the camera app. I needed proof for the police, for my sister, for myself. I burst out onto the back porch, the frigid air a slap against my face. I pointed my phone at the wet tracks on the wood, but they were already starting to fade, the moisture sublimating into the dry, freezing air, leaving behind only faint, dark stains. I snapped a few pictures, but I knew they would look like nothing, just random patches of dampness. I ran down the stairs, my boots crunching in the snow, and aimed my camera at the prints leading from the lake. They too were vanishing. The sun, weak as it was just high enough to begin its work. The dark, wet impressions were slowly losing their definition, the edges softening, freezing over and being dusted by the light, shifting wind. By the time I took the photos, they were just shallow, ambiguous depressions in the snow, easily mistaken for the natural indentations of melted and refrozen patches. My perfect, undeniable evidence was literally evaporating before my eyes. Frustrated and terrified, I retreated back inside the cabin. My proof was gone, as ephemeral as the creature that had made it. This realization was a new kind of horror. The entity was not only a master of stealthy entrances, but its very presence left behind evidence that self-destructed. How could I ever prove this was happening? Who would ever believe a story backed by nothing more than ambiguous photos of damp wood and shallow holes in the snow? I knew then that I was on my own. No one would be coming to help me. The authorities would dismiss my call. My friends would think I was losing my mind. The entity had chosen its battlefield perfectly. An isolated location with a witness who had no credible proof. I was the sole custodian of this terrible secret, and my own defense was my only option. My fear, once again, hardened into a grim, practical resolve. My cabin was a fortress, and I was about to reinforce its walls. I spent the rest of the day in a flurry of frantic defensive activity. I dragged the heaviest pieces of furniture, the solid oak dining table, a heavy ironwood rack, and barricaded the front and back doors. I went around the cabin and hammered nails into the tops of all the window frames, sealing them shut. It was a crude, desperate act, but it made me feel like I was doing something, fighting back against the inevitable sense of violation. My focus then turned to surveillance. I couldn't trust my own eyes alone. I found a powerful old spotlight in one of the storage sheds, its beam capable of cutting through the deep winter darkness. I set it up on my back porch, aimed directly at the hole in the ice. I would not let the darkness be its shield any longer. If it came again, I would put a spotlight on it. I would see what it was. The binoculars became a permanent extension of my body. I sat by the picture window, my new command post, and kept a constant vigil on the lake. My writing was completely forgotten, my novel a distant memory from another. Life. My entire existence had been narrowed down to this single, obsessive task. Watch the ice. Watch the hole. Watch for any sign of movement, any shadow beneath the surface, any ripple in the black, still water. As night fell, I turned on every light in the cabin, creating a small, defiant island of light in the vast, encroaching darkness. I lit a fire in the hearth, its warmth and light a comfort against the oppressive cold outside. I sat in my armchair, facing the lake, my binoculars in my lap, the spotlight on the porch switched on, its powerful beam a stark white pillar on the ice. I was ready. I was as ready as a person could be for an impossible creature to crawl out of a frozen lake. But the night was silent. The hours between 2 and 4, the time of the haunting, passed in a deep, profound, and utterly unnerving quiet. There was no thumping, no scratching, no whispers. The hole in the ice remained a still, black eye under the beam of my spotlight, empty and unmoving. The silence, which had once been my enemy, was now a source of deep, suspicious dread. Was it gone? Had my defenses, my light, my vigilance scared it away? The second night was the same, a deep, unviolated silence. I kept my vigil, my eyes burning from staring through the binoculars at the pool of light on the ice. The hole remained still, black and empty. The profound quiet of the wilderness had returned, but I no longer trusted it. It felt like a mask, a placid expression hiding a monstrous intent. I was a soldier on watch, and the enemy's refusal to show itself was a form of psychological warfare. By the third silent night, however, a new feeling began to take root in the barren soil of my fear. A cautious, fragile hope. Maybe it had worked. Maybe my defenses, as crude as they were, had been enough. The light, the barricades, my constant, unwavering vigilance. Perhaps the creature, whatever it was a thing of darkness and stealth, and my harsh, defiant island of light was a deterrent it could not, or would not challenge. During the day, I watched the hole in the ice with a scientific curiosity. A thin, crystalline skin was beginning to form over the black water, the lake's natural healing process slowly trying to close the wound. Each day, the new ice was a little thicker, a little stronger. It was a visual representation of my own, returning sense of security. The world was freezing over the anomaly, sealing the gateway back to the dark, watery depths from which it had come. After a full week of uninterrupted silence, I finally allowed myself to relax. I unbarricaded the doors, though I still locked them meticulously. I started sleeping in my own bed again, though I kept the spotlight on the lake running all night. A silent, electric watchman. The intense, high-alert paranoia began to recede, replaced by a weary sense of victory. I had faced the impossible, and I had held my ground. My fortress had held. I even started writing again. The words came slowly at first, my mind still half listening for a sound that was no longer there. But gradually, the fictional world of my novel began to reassert itself, providing a welcome escape from the horrors of the real one. I was reclaiming my life, my routine, my purpose. The entity from the lake had been a monstrous, terrifying interruption, but I had weathered it. I was a survivor. I look back on that brief period of peace with a kind of sorrowful irony. I was so proud of myself, so confident in my own strength and resilience. I had confronted a supernatural, or at least paranormal event, with practical, real-world solutions, and I had won. I had stared into the abyss, and I had convinced the abyss to back down. The story had reached its conclusion, and I was the victorious, final girl. My mistake was in assuming that the entity I was dealing with thought like me. I had assumed it was a creature of simple, primal urges, one that could be scared away by bright lights and loud noises. I had failed to consider that it might be intelligent, that it might be capable of learning, of adapting, of changing its tactics. I had won a battle, but I had completely misunderstood the nature of the war. The entity had not been scared away. It had been observing me. It had watched me set up my defenses. It had seen where I placed my lights, where I built my barricades. It had studied my methods of surveillance. It had learned the layout of my fortress. And now that it understood my defenses, it was preparing to bypass them completely. It was about to show me that my walls were meaningless. My sense of victory had made me complacent. I had begun to believe I was safe again, and in doing so, I had lowered my guard. The silence was not a retreat. It was a period of observation, of tactical reassessment on its part. It had tested my perimeter and found it secured. So, it decided on a new point of attack. Not from the outside, but from a direction I could never have anticipated. From below. And so, I slept soundly in my bed, bathed in the false light of my own victory, completely unaware that the game was not over. It had simply entered a new, more terrifying phase. The thumping from the lake had been a warning. The footprints had been a visit. But the next stage of the haunting would be an infiltration. The monster was done knocking on the door. It was now coming up through the floor. My week of peace was a cruel trick, a momentary lull designed to make the next attack all the more devastating. I had just settled into bed, the comforting weight of my wool blanket a familiar comfort, when the sound returned. But it was not from the lake. It was not a distant thumping from across the ice. This sound was immediate. It was intimate. It was coming from directly beneath the floorboards of the cabin. It was right under my feet. The sound was the same, yet horrifyingly different. It was the same slow, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. But without the muffling effect of water and ice, it was a raw, powerful, and deeply resonant sound. The entire cabin seemed to vibrate with each beat, a low, guttural pulse that I could feel in my teeth, in my bones. It had bypassed my spotlight. It had bypassed my vigil. It had tunneled under the frozen earth, and was now directly beneath me. My blood ran cold. I leaped out of bed, my feet hitting the freezing wooden floor. The cabin was built on thick stilts, at the very edge of the shore, creating a crawl space underneath that was dark, frozen, and inaccessible, and that is where it was now. It was in the private, dark space of my cabin's foundations, knocking on the underside of my floor as if demanding to be let in. My fortress had been breached from below. I ran into the living room, my mind a maelstrom of terror. My spotlight was still dutifully illuminating the now frozen hole in the ice. A useless beacon against a threat that was no longer out there. The real threat was here, under my feet, its slow, patient heartbeat, the new rhythm of my house. I was standing on the drum that it was beating, a helpless captive in its new, more intimate stage. The thumping continued for an hour, a relentless, possessive rhythm that seemed to be exploring the entire underside of the cabin. It would move from beneath the kitchen to beneath the living room. And then, most terrifyingly, back to beneath my bedroom. It was mapping my home from below, learning the layout of my life. And all I could do was stand there and listen. A terrified, helpless homeowner listening to a monstrous inspection. When it finally stopped, the silence it left behind was even worse than before. The entity was no longer just a mystery in the lake. It was now a confirmed presence in the very foundations of my home. It had proven that it could get to me, that it could touch my space whenever it wanted. The barricades on my doors were a pathetic joke. The real threat was not trying to get in through the door. It was trying to get in through the floor. The next morning, I was afraid to even step onto my back porch. It felt like contaminated ground, but I knew I had to check. I had to see if there was any physical sign of the night's new horror. I slowly unbolted the door and stepped out into the frigid air. The porch was empty. The snow was undisturbed. There was nothing. I let out a shaky breath of relief. But then my eyes fell upon the small wooden railing. There, placed perfectly in the center of the railing, was a stone. It was a single, smooth, dark gray stone, worn by decades of water into a perfect flat oval. It was a river stone, the kind you would find at the bottom of a lake bed. It was wet, a dark, damp spot slowly freezing in the morning air. And it had not been there the day before. It was a gift. A message from the thing below. I stared at the stone, my mind struggling to process the implications. It had come from under the house, onto my porch, and had left this for me. A piece of the lake bed. A piece of its world. It was an offering. A calling card. It was a clear, undeniable statement that it could not only get close to me, but it could manipulate my environment, leave objects from its world in mine. The barrier between us was dissolving. I didn't touch the stone. I backed away from it as if it were a venomous snake. I retreated into my cabin and locked the door, my heart pounding. This was a new phase of the game. The entity was no longer just a sound. It was an intelligence that was actively trying to communicate, to interact. It was leaving me trophies from its dark, watery kingdom, and my porch was its new display case. The stone sat on my railing all day, a dark, silent accusation. I couldn't bring myself to touch it, to flick it off into the snow. To do so felt like an acknowledgement, a response. I was terrified that if I interacted with its gift, it would interpret it as an invitation to offer another. So I left it there, a monument to my fear, and tried to work, constantly aware of the strange, wet object sitting just on the other side of my wall. That night, the thumping under the floorboards returned, as I knew it would. But my fear was now tinged with a new, strange flavor. I was no longer just afraid of the sound. I was afraid of what I would find in the morning. What new token from the bottom of the lake would be waiting for me? The entity had turned the simple act of waking up and looking out my window into a moment of profound, gut-wrenching dread. The next morning, there was a new gift. The stone was gone. In its place, arranged in a perfect, intricate spiral on the wood of my porch, were several small, dark pieces of waterlogged wood. They were ancient, gnarled pieces of tree branches, worn smooth by the water, and they smelled of mud and deep, cold decay. The spiral was a deliberate pattern, a clear sign of an organizing artistic intelligence. This was not random. This was sculpture. The sight of the spiral, so perfect and so unnatural, was more terrifying than the stone had been. A single object could be a fluke. An intricate pattern was a statement. It was a demonstration of patience, of dexterity, of a mind at work. I was being courted by a monstrous artist, a sculptor whose medium was the detritus of the lakebed and whose gallery was my own back porch. The gifts were becoming more complex. The messages were becoming clearer. I was trapped in a conversation with a thing I could not see, a conversation I did not want to have. I felt my sanity begin to fray at the edges. How could I explain this to anyone? A moving sound, a vanishing footprint, a wet stone, a spiral of old wood. These were the fever dreams of a madwoman, not the coherent facts of a police report. My isolation was a cage of my own making, reinforced by the sheer unbelievability of my situation. I began to feel like the cabin itself was an extension of the lake, that the water was not just outside but below, and that it was slowly seeping up through the floorboards. The air in the cabin felt damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth and decay. I was living on a raft in the middle of a haunted ocean, and the thing from the deep was now decorating my raft with trinkets from the abyss. My logbook, my one source of comfort, now seemed like a descent into madness. Night 15. Thumping under. The kitchen. Night 16. Thumping under the bedroom. Morning 16. Spiral of wet wood on porch. Reading my own neat clinical handwriting felt like reading the case file of a patient who was losing their grip on reality. I was documenting my own unraveling, one impossible event at a time. The entity had completely outmaneuvered me. It had understood that my defenses were aimed at the world outside my cabin, so it had moved to the space directly underneath it. It knew I couldn't see it there. It knew I couldn't shine my spotlight on it. It had found the perfect blind spot in my surveillance, the perfect flaw in my fortress. And it was exploiting it with a terrifying artistic patience. I was no longer just afraid of an intrusion. I was afraid of the entity's creativity, of its escalating psychological warfare. What would it leave for me next? A waterlogged doll? A string of rusted fishing lures? The possibilities were endless, and my own imagination became my worst enemy, concocting ever more horrifying gifts that it might bring up from the deep. The thumping under the floor was no longer just a sound. It was the sound of the entity at work. It was the sound of it searching the lakebed for its next piece of art, for its next message. It was the sound of it preparing its next gift for me. The space below my feet had become its workshop, and I was the unwilling recipient of its dark, patient, and terrifying craft. The spiral of wood was the final straw. It was too deliberate, too artistic, too undeniably strange to be ignored. I could no longer live in this state of quiet, passive terror, simply documenting the escalating madness. My fear, which had been a paralyzing agent, was now boiling over into a frantic, desperate need for intervention. I had to tell someone. I had to try to get help, no matter how insane my story sounded. My own sanity depended on it. I looked up the number for the sheriff's department in the nearest town. It was a small, regional office, responsible for a vast, sparsely populated area of wilderness. I knew, even as I dialed, that my call would be unusual, but I clung to a desperate hope that they might have experience with strange occurrences in these isolated woods. Perhaps my story would not be entirely unheard of. Perhaps they would have a protocol for this. A man with a calm, gravelly voice answered the phone. I introduced myself, my voice trembling slightly, and began to lay out my story. I started from the beginning, trying to sound as rational and as factual as possible. I told him about the thumping sound, its movement across the lake, the impossible hole in the ice, and the footprints that had vanished. I described the wet stone on my railing and the spiral of wood on my porch. The sheriff, a man who introduced himself as Sheriff Brody, listened patiently. He didn't interrupt. He let me tell my entire, rambling, unbelievable story. His patience was a small mercy, and it gave me a sliver of hope. When I finally finished, my voice a raw whisper, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint crackle of his radio in the background, a sound from a sane, orderly world. "Ma'am," he began, his voice slow and measured. "You've been up at that old cabin all winter by yourself. Is that right?" The question was not an accusation, but it was an assessment. He was not evaluating the evidence I had presented. He was evaluating my state of mind. "Yes," I said, my heart sinking. "I'm a writer. I came here for the solitude." I could already hear the conclusion he was drawing. "It gets pretty lonely out there," he continued, his tone a mixture of professional sympathy and gentle condescension. "We get calls like this from time to time, especially this deep into the winter. We have a name for it. We call it cabin fever. The silence and the isolation, they can play tricks on your mind. You start seeing things, hearing things that aren't there. Your mind gets desperate for stimulation, so it starts creating its own." "But the scratches on the floor in 7A, I interjected, my voice rising. I had forgotten to mention the police visit from my previous apartment story. "No, wait," I stammered, my timelines crossing in my panicked mind. I was confusing my horrors. This was a new place, a new fear. "I mean, the hole in the ice, the spiral of wood, that's real. It's not in my head." The slip-up, my confusing of details, only made me sound less credible. The sheriff sighed, a patient, weary sound. A hole in the ice can be caused by a natural spring or a methane gas bubble from the lake bed. And a spiral of wood, well, the wind does strange things out on that lake. Ma'am, what you're describing are a series of strange but likely unrelated natural events. Your mind, under the stress of total isolation, is just connecting the dots into a scary story. He had an explanation for everything, a neat, tidy, logical box for my terror. I felt a wave of helpless frustration. He had already made up his mind. I was a lonely woman suffering from cabin fever. My evidence was just a collection of natural phenomena, misinterpreted by a mind that was starved for human contact. He was not listening to me. He was diagnosing me. The official world, once again, was refusing to acknowledge the reality of my experience. "I appreciate your concern for my well-being, Sheriff," I said, my voice cold and tight. "But I am not imagining this. Something is happening at this cabin." He promised to send a patrol car to drive by the area when he had a man free, a gesture so empty and placating it was insulting. I knew no one was coming. I was a nuisance call, a lonely woman to be pitied and then forgotten. I thanked him for his time and hung up the phone. The click of the phone disconnecting was a sound of profound finality. I had been officially dismissed. To the law, I was not a person in danger. I was a problem of perception, a woman whose solitude had become a pathology. My fear had been given a name, cabin fever, and in naming it, he had stripped it of all its legitimacy. The entity, whatever it was now protected by a diagnosis that was applied not to it, but to me. My last hope for official intervention was gone, but the need to be believed, to have another human being acknowledge my reality, was a desperate, primal urge. I had one last resort. My best friend, Chloe. We had been friends since college, and she knew me better than anyone. She knew I was not prone to hysterics or flights of fancy. I drove my car to the top of the hill at the end of my road, the only place I could get a reliable cell signal, and I called her. I told her everything, my voice a low, urgent whisper against the whistling of the wind. I described the sounds, the hole, the footprints, the impossible gifts from the bottom of the lake. I told her about the sheriff's dismissal, about the diagnosis of cabin fever. I was begging her, not for help, but for the simple, precious gift of her belief. I needed one other person in the world to know that this was real. She listened, and her silence was heavy with a familiar, loving concern. "Lena," she said, her voice soft and careful. "This sounds terrifying. I can hear in your voice how scared you are, but you have been completely alone for almost 2 months in the middle of nowhere. That kind of isolation isn't natural. It does things to your head. Don't you think it's possible the sheriff is right?" "So you think I'm imagining it?" I asked, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. The wood arranged in a perfect spiral, the stone that was wet and below freezing temperatures. Am I imagining that? I needed her to confront the physical evidence, the impossible details, but she sidestepped them, just as the sheriff had, focusing instead on the state of the witness, not the testimony itself. "I don't think you're imagining it," she said, a careful, diplomatic choice of words. "I think you're interpreting it. You're alone, you're stressed from your deadline, and your brain is taking strange, unrelated things and weaving them into a scary story because it's a better narrative than just being lonely. Maybe you should come back to the city for a week. Just take a break. Reset yourself." Her words were meant to be kind, an offer of escape, but they felt like a betrayal. She was offering me a cure for a disease I didn't have. The problem wasn't in my head. It was under my house. But how could I make her see that? My reality was so far outside the bounds of her own that she could not accept it. To believe me would be to accept that the world was a far stranger and more terrifying place than she was comfortable with. It was easier to believe I was sick. I ended the call, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. It was over. I had been cast out. The authorities, my friends, they had all gently, or not so gently, pushed me outside the circle of shared reality. I was on my own, an island of terror in a sea of well-meaning disbelief. The entity had not only invaded my home, It had successfully and completely isolated me from my own species. I drove back down the hill to my cabin, the small wooden structure looking more like a prison than a sanctuary. The entity could not have planned a more perfect campaign. It attacked, with sounds no one else could hear, with evidence that disappeared, with gifts that seemed like natural debris. Its methods were so perfectly unbelievable that they created their own shield, a shield made of other people's skepticism. I was now truly, completely alone with it. No one was coming. No one would believe me. My sanity was now a matter of debate for everyone but myself. The entity had won a crucial victory. It had eliminated any possibility of outside interference. It was just me and the thing under the floor now. And as darkness began to fall, I knew that it would be bolder than ever. It had no reason to be subtle anymore. My life after that was a quiet study in fear. I stopped trying to convince anyone. I stopped calling for help. The world had made its decision about my story, and I would not appeal the verdict. My existence shrank to the four walls of the cabin, my only companion the silent, listening entity that lived beneath my feet. I no longer documented the sounds in my logbook. To do so felt like participating in my own diagnosis. Instead, I simply endured. The nightly thumping became the new rhythm of my life, a dark and steady heartbeat that underscored my waking hours and haunted my shallow, fitful sleep. I no longer felt the need to investigate it. I knew what it was, the sound of my tormentor, patiently at work in its subterranean workshop. The gifts on the porch continued to appear. A strange, fossilized fish skeleton, a cluster of shimmering, pearlescent mussel shells arranged like a flower. I left them untouched, monuments to my own private, unbelievable horror. I was a ghost in my own life, drifting through the days in a numb haze, my work on my novel completely abandoned. The fictional horrors I could invent seemed pale and childish compared to the real, tangible dread that was my constant companion. I was living in a horror story, and I had no idea how it was going to end. My only goal was survival, to make it through each night and greet the cold, indifferent light of morning. The entity, for its part, seemed content with this new status quo. It had its routine, and I had mine. It would thump. It would leave its strange, aquatic sculptures, and I would watch, and I would fear. It was a strange, silent, and deeply unbalanced domesticity. We were the only two living things for miles around, locked in a bizarre, one-sided relationship. The cabin was our shared contested territory. One night, the thumping was more intense than ever before. It was a deep, powerful, and angry sound, a frantic, desperate rhythm that made the whole cabin tremble. It was not the slow, patient work I had become accustomed to. This was different. This felt like a prelude to something new, an escalation. I huddled under my blankets on the couch, listening to the furious subterranean assault, and I knew that the game was about to change again. The sound continued for hours, a relentless, punishing rhythm. It did not stop at 4 a.m. as it usually did. It continued right up until the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the edges of my drawn curtains. And then it stopped. The sudden silence was so absolute, so profound, that it was more terrifying than the noise had been. It was the silence of something accomplished, of something finished. I lay on the couch, my body trembling, until the sun was fully up. I was afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid of what new horror the morning light would reveal. I felt a change in the air of the cabin. A deep, penetrating cold that went far beyond the usual winter chill. It was a damp, cellar-like cold. A cold that felt like it was radiating from the very walls of the cabin itself. Slowly, I forced myself to sit up, and I saw it. Every single window in the cabin, the large picture window in the living room, the small kitchen window over the sink, was completely covered in a thick, feathery, intricate layer of frost. But it was not on the outside of the glass, as it should have been. It was on the inside. A perfect crystalline layer of ice had formed on the interior of every pane. I stared in disbelief, my breath misting in the frigid air of the room. This was impossible. The fire had been going all night. The cabin was warm. For frost to form on the inside of the windows, the temperature inside would have had to plummet to well below freezing, and the humidity would have had to be impossibly high. It was a violation of the laws of physics. It was a miracle of a horrifying and unnatural kind. The entity had done this. It had somehow altered the very atmosphere within my cabin while I slept. It had brought the deep, freezing cold of the lake bottom inside with it, painting the windows with the icy breath of its own world. My fortress was not just breached. It had been completely, impossibly occupied. The entity was no longer just under my floor. It had been in the room with me, and it had left a message, written in ice. I walked slowly towards the large picture window, my bare feet numb on the cold floor. The layer of frost was thick and opaque, a beautiful, terrifying curtain of ice that blocked out the view of the lake. It was intricately patterned, like the crystalline structure of a giant snowflake. It was a perfect, uniform sheet of impossible cold. But as I got closer, I saw that it was not entirely uniform. There was a design etched into it. There, in the very center of the large pane of glass, was a pattern. It was a huge, sprawling spiral, identical to the one that had been made with the waterlogged wood on my porch. But this one was etched perfectly into the thick layer of interior frost. The lines were clean and precise, as if they had been traced by a single, long, and impossibly steady finger. The entity had not just changed the atmosphere of my home, it had left its signature. I reached out a trembling hand, my fingers hovering, just inches from the glass. I could feel the intense cold radiating from it. The spiral was a piece of art, a horrifying masterpiece created from my own captured breath and the entity's unnatural chill. It had stood here, in my living room, while I slept just a few feet away on the couch. It had stood here and drawn a picture on my window. The intimacy of the act was a violation that transcended fear. This was the ultimate proof of its power. It could pass through my walls and locks without a sound. It could manipulate the temperature and humidity of my home. It could move with a silence and stealth that was supernatural. And it could stand inches from my sleeping body, leaving behind only these cold, beautiful, and terrifying calling cards. My barricades, my locks, my vigilance, they were all a child's game against a force that did not obey the rules of the physical world. I backed away from the window, a strangled sob escaping my lips. The cabin was not my home. It was its terrarium, and I was the specimen it was observing, and occasionally interacting with. The gifts on the porch, the frost on the windows, these were not acts of aggression. They were acts of ownership. The entity was not trying to scare me away. It was decorating its new home, and I just happened to be living in it. The despair that settled over me was final. It was a cold, quiet certainty that I was utterly, completely, and hopelessly outmatched. There was no defense against this. There was no escape. Even if I were to flee the cabin now, what good would it do? It had proven that it could follow me, that its influence was not tied to the lake. It had come under my house. It had come inside my house. It was here with me now. I spent the rest of the day in a fugue state, sitting on the couch, wrapped in every blanket I owned, watching as the sun slowly, inevitably, began to set. The frost on the windows did not melt. It remained a permanent, crystalline barrier, a testament to the night's impossible events. The cabin grew dark around me, but I did not turn on the lights. I just sat there, in the cold, waiting for the night to fall completely. My sense of reality had been completely shattered. The world no longer made sense. Physics, logic, reason, they were all useless in the face of this. The only truth was the cold, the silence, and the entity that I shared my home with. I was no longer afraid of what it might do. I was now living in the quiet, terrifying aftermath of what it had done. It had shown me the extent of its power, and it was absolute. The second act of my ordeal was over. The investigation had led to nothing. The psychological game had been won, completely and utterly, by the entity. I was isolated, I was discredited, and now I knew, with absolute certainty, that no physical barrier could protect me. The entity was not outside trying to get in. It was inside, and it was patiently waiting for me to realize that it was never going to leave. As darkness consumed the room, and the beautiful, terrible spiral on the window faded into the blackness of the night, I was left with only one question. What do you do when you are trapped in a cage with a monster that you cannot see, cannot fight, and cannot escape? What do you do when your only option is to wait for it to reveal its final purpose? The despair was a quiet, cold, and heavy blanket, and it was the only thing I had left. The breaking point did not come as a loud explosion, but as a quiet, cold snap in the dead of the following night. I was huddled on the couch, listening to the now familiar thumping from beneath the floor, when the frost on the window began to gently glow in the moonlight. I stared at the spiral pattern, at its perfect, mocking geometry, and in that moment, the despair that had paralyzed me for days finally fractured, and something new, something hard and sharp, began to emerge from the cracks. It was a terrifying, reckless calm. If I could not keep it out, then I would go out to meet it. The thought was utterly insane, a complete abdication of my own survival instinct, but it was also the only logical conclusion left. Hiding was useless. My fortress had been breached from every possible angle. The entity could get under my house. It could get inside my house. My passivity, my fear, had done nothing to stop it. My only remaining move was to abandon defense and choose confrontation. My fear, which had been a vast, shapeless ocean, now had a focal point, a destination, the hole in the ice. It was its door, the gateway between its world and mine. It was the source of the footprints, the source of the gifts, the place from which it had emerged to draw its icy breath on my windows. I had spent weeks terrified of what might come out of that hole. Now, I felt an overpowering, obsessive need to go to it, to look into it, to see what was looking back. This decision was not born of courage. It was born of an exhaustion so profound that it mimicked bravery. I was tired of being afraid. I was tired of listening, of waiting, of reacting. I was tired of being the subject of its strange, silent experiment. By choosing to walk out onto that ice, I was taking back a small, desperate piece of my own agency. I would not wait for it to come to me anymore. I would go to it. I would force the confrontation. My mind, which had been a storm of fear, now became a quiet, efficient workshop, focused on a single, terrible task. I would go out onto the ice at dawn. I needed light. I began to prepare, my movements slow and deliberate. I put on my warmest clothes, layering wool and down until I felt like a bloated, clumsy astronaut. I found a coil of thick rope in the woodshed, a length of twine, and a heavy wood-chopping axe. I didn't know why I needed them, but they felt like necessary tools for a journey into the unknown. The axe, in particular, was a comfort. Its weight in my hands was a solid, tangible thing in a world that had become increasingly abstract and unreal. It was a tool of pure, simple physics. It could break things. It could defend me. Against a creature that could walk through walls and manipulate the temperature of a room, an axe was a pathetic, almost laughable defense. But it was a defense I could understand, and it was better than nothing. I sat by the window and watched the sky, waiting for the first hints of gray to appear on the horizon. The thumping under the floor had stopped, as if it knew my decision had been made, as if it were now waiting for me outside. The cabin felt like a cage I was about to be released from. The thought of stepping out onto that vast, open expanse of ice was terrifying, but it was also a relief. At least out there, I would be facing the threat, not cowering from it. As the sky began to lighten, I packed a small thermos of hot coffee, a practical gesture that felt absurdly normal in the face of my insane plan. I tied one end of the rope around the thickest support beam of the porch, and the other end around my waist. If the ice broke, I would at least have a chance. It was a small, desperate precaution against a danger I couldn't possibly comprehend. Left my logbook open on the table, a silent testament to my story in case I did not return. I looked around my small, violated sanctuary one last time. The frosted windows, the barricaded doors. It was a home that had been turned into a prison by an invisible warden, and I was now choosing to walk out into the prison yard, to face that warden directly. I was terrified, but I was also, for the first time in weeks, no longer helpless. With the axe in my hand and the rope around my waist, I stepped out onto the back porch. The air was so cold it stung my face. The world was silent, bathed in the pale, ethereal light of dawn. The hole in the ice was a dark, waiting maw in the distance. I took a deep breath, the frigid air searing my lungs, and I took my first, tentative step off the porch and onto the frozen surface of the lake. The surface of the ice was a landscape of its own, a terrain of smooth patches, frozen ripples, and areas of cracked, refrozen ice that looked like giant spider webs. With every step, the ice beneath my feet would groan and creak, a chorus of protest at my intrusion. Each sound sent a jolt of fear through me. I was walking on the very skin of the monster's world, a thin, fragile barrier between myself and the dark, cold depths where it lived. My progress was slow, my steps deliberate and cautious. I kept the axe held out to my side, more for balance than for any real hope of defense. The rope trailed behind me, a thin umbilical cord connecting me to the safety of the shore, a shore that seemed to be receding with every step I took. The cabin grew smaller and smaller, a tiny, lonely outpost in a vast, indifferent world of white. I had never felt so alone or so exposed. As I drew closer to the hole, I could see the details more clearly. The edges were not melted, as I had first thought. They looked as if they had been cut, or perhaps shattered outwards from a great pressure below, and then flash frozen into a smooth, black, glassy ring. It was a perfect, unnatural scar on the face of the lake. It was a wound, and I was walking towards its dark, unblinking center, drawn by a morbid and unstoppable compulsion. The silence was absolute. The wind had died down completely. The only sounds were the crunch of my own boots on the snow-dusted ice and the frantic, panicked beating of my own heart. I was walking into the heart of the silence, into the very place from which the nightly thumping had emanated. I felt like an astronaut stepping onto the surface of a dead, alien world. The rules of my own world no longer applied here. Halfway there, I stopped. The sheer scale of what I was doing, the utter madness of it, washed over me. I was a writer, a woman who lived a life of quiet contemplation. And here I was, in the middle of a frozen lake, armed with an axe, walking towards a mysterious hole that was the source of an impossible, terrifying phenomenon. If I died here, no one would ever know the truth. They would just find my body in the spring. A sad, simple story of a woman who fell through the ice. But the thought of turning back was even more terrifying. To return to the cabin, to wade in, that cage for the entity to continue its slow, inevitable encroachment. That was a slower, more agonizing kind of death. No, the only way out was forward. The only way to end this was to see it through to its conclusion, whatever that might be. I took a deep breath, my resolve hardening once more, and continued my slow, deliberate march. Finally, I was there. I stood at the edge of the hole, my boots just a few feet from the dark, open water. The air above the hole was warmer, the mist rising from it caressing my face with a strange, damp chill. The water itself was black, perfectly still, and seemed to suck the light from the air. It was a pool of liquid darkness, a gateway to the abyss that lay beneath the ice. I peered over the edge, my knuckles white as I gripped the handle of the axe. I could see nothing but my own reflection, a pale, distorted mask of fear staring back at me. The water was impossibly dark, revealing none of its secrets. There was no sign of the creature, no hint of what lay in the crushing, lightless depths below. There was only the black water, the smooth cut ice, and the profound waiting silence. This was it, the point of confrontation. I had come all this way, had faced down all my fears, to stand at the edge of this impossible place. I had expected something to happen. A sound, a movement, a great tentacle to lash out from the depths. But there was nothing. Only the silence, and the cold, and the dark water. The anticipation was a physical pressure, a building climax with no release. And so, I did the only thing I could think to do. I had come here to confront it, to see it. I knelt at the edge of the hole, the cold of the ice seeping through the thick fabric of my pants. I leaned forward, my face just a few feet from the water's surface, and I stared down into the abyss, my own terrified eyes staring back at me. And I waited for the abyss to stare back. I knelt at the edge of the abyss for what seemed like an eternity, my own reflection the only monster staring back. The silence was absolute. The water was a sheet of black, unmoving glass. There was no sound, no movement, no sign of the immense, powerful entity that had created this wound in the world. My grand confrontation, my desperate suicidal act of bravery, was being met with a profound and terrifying indifference. It refused to show itself. The anticlimax was a new kind of horror. I had prepared myself for a fight, for a monster, for a definitive, terrible answer. But I was met with nothing. Just the cold, the silence, and the impossible hole. It was as if the entity was mocking me, showing me that it operated on its own terms, on its own schedule. It would not be summoned. It would not be provoked. My trespass meant nothing to it. It would reveal itself only when it chose to. Defeated, cold, and more terrified than ever, I slowly got to my feet. The journey back to the cabin was a walk of shame. I had faced the monster, and the monster hadn't even bothered to show up. It had simply ignored me. The feeling of insignificance was crushing. I was not even a worthy opponent. I was just a frightened animal, shivering at the edge of its lair, and it had not deigned to give me its attention. Back inside the cabin, I stripped off my freezing outer layers, my body trembling with cold and adrenaline. My failed confrontation had left me with no answers, only deeper and more terrifying questions. If it wasn't a creature waiting in the depths, then what was it? What was the source of the sound, the gifts, the impossible frost? My direct, physical approach had failed. There was only one avenue of investigation left: the past. If the answer was not in the present, I would have to find it in history. This cabin, this lake, this land, they were old. My tormentor felt ancient. Perhaps the story of what was happening to me was not a new one. Perhaps I was just the latest chapter in a much older book. My new obsession was born in that moment. I would not just be a witness to the phenomenon. I would become its historian. I turned to the only tool I had, my laptop and its painfully slow, satellite-based internet connection. I began my research. I searched for the history of Blackwood Lake, for the names of the families who had built the first cabins here, for any local news articles that mentioned strange occurrences, drownings, or disappearances. I became a digital archaeologist, digging through the layers of the internet for any shard of information, any clue. For hours, my search yielded nothing. The official history of the area was sparse and mundane. Logging towns, fishing resorts, the quiet, unremarkable passage of time. There were no stories of lake monsters or mysterious hauntings. There was only the simple, boring history of a remote northern lake. My hope began to dwindle. Perhaps there were no answers. Perhaps this was just my own, private, inexplicable madness after all. But then I stumbled upon it. It wasn't a news article or a historical record. It was a link in a long-dead forum about local folklore, a post made by a user over a decade ago. The post was about a self-published book, a small, obscure collection of local legends and oral histories compiled by a town historian in the 1950s. The book was titled Whispers of the North Woods, and one of the chapter titles listed was The Sleeper of Blackwood Lake. My heart pounded in my chest. I frantically searched for a digital copy of the book. It was long out of print, a forgotten relic. But after an hour of desperate searching, I found it, scanned and uploaded to an obscure university archive of regional folklore. I downloaded the file, my slow internet connection stretching the minutes into an eternity. Finally, the file was there. I opened it, my hands shaking as I scrolled to the chapter on Blackwood Lake. The text was old, typed on a manual typewriter, the letters faint and uneven. But the story it told was clear, and it was a story I recognized. It spoke of a much older legend from the original indigenous inhabitants of the area. They never went out on the lake in the winter. They believed that the deep, brutal cold did not just create ice, it created a prison for an ancient, hungry spirit that lived in the lake's deepest, darkest point. The legend described the spirit as a thing of insatiable hunger and profound cold. It was not a ghost of a person, but something much older, a primal elemental that was part of the lake itself. The legend said that in the time before men, it had free reign, and its presence would drain the warmth from the land, leaving behind only frost and stillness. It was the personification of the deep, unending cold of the northern winter, a being of pure, desolate entropy. According to the old story, the spirit was tricked and trapped by the first winter, a winter colder than any that had come since. The ice that formed on the lake that year was impossibly thick, a sheet of blue ice that the sun could not penetrate. It became a permanent prison, and as long as the winter was cold enough, as long as the ice was strong enough, the sleeper would remain dormant in the dark, silent water at the lake's deepest point. My eyes scanned the text, my heart pounding. And then I found the passage that made the blood freeze in my veins. The legend spoke of a warning sign, a harbinger of a weak winter when the ice was not as thick as it should be. It said that when the sleeper begins to stir, when it feels the weakness in the roof of its prison, it begins to test the ice. It begins to strike at it from below, a slow, rhythmic, and patient assault, a thumping sound. It was all there. The legend described the sound perfectly. The slow, rhythmic thumping was the sound of the sleeper testing its cage. The movement of the sound across the lake was the sleeper, searching for the weakest point, the thinnest part of the ice. It was not a creature hunting me. It was a prisoner, systematically searching for a way out. And the unusually mild start to this winter, which I had so enjoyed, had given it its first chance at escape in a century. The hole in the ice, the footprints, the gifts. It was all part of the story. The sleeper, having found the weakest point, had finally managed to break a small hole through, a breathing hole. It had reached out, leaving traces of its world in mine. The gifts were not messages for me. Not really. They were just debris. The first things to spill out of a prison that was beginning to crack at the seams. I was not the one being haunted. I was just the person who happened to be living next to the failing prison wall. This revelation was, in its own way, more terrifying than any other explanation. I was not dealing with a ghost, or a squatter, or a stalker. I was dealing with an ancient, primal force of nature, a being of immense power whose motivations were as alien and as unknowable as the crushing, lightless depths of the lake itself. And its prison, the one thing that had kept it contained for generations, was failing. I looked out the window at the lake. It was no longer a beautiful, static landscape. It was a cage, a fragile, thinning sheet of ice holding back an ancient, hungry power. And the hole, my impossible, terrifying hole, was the first crack in the bars. The thumping was not a threat directed at me. It was the sound of a prisoner, methodically breaking down its own cell door, and my cabin just happened to be standing next to it. The story was no longer about me. I was an insignificant bystander, a footnote in a much older, much larger horror story. The entity wasn't trying to scare me. It likely didn't even know or care that I was here. My fear, my terror, my entire ordeal, it was all just collateral damage in its slow, patient, and relentless escape. I was just a mouse, trembling, in the corner of a room where two gods were about to go to war. I now understood the true nature of the threat, but the knowledge brought no comfort. It only amplified my sense of powerlessness. How could I possibly fight a thing like this? An ancient spirit of cold and hunger. The axe I had carried out onto the ice seemed like a child's toy. My only defense, my only hope, had been the ice itself, and the ice was now failing. I stood at my window, the folklore text glowing on my laptop screen, and I stared at the hole in the ice. The sun was setting, and the hole was a dark, watching eye in the dying light. The silence of the evening was no longer a reprieve. It was the quiet before the final catastrophic breach. The sleeper was awake. Its prison was broken. And I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and as clear as the ice itself, that the thumping I would hear tonight would not be a test. It would be the sound of the door finally breaking down. There was no waiting for the early hours of the morning. As soon as full darkness fell, the sound began. And it was not the slow, patient thumping of before. This was a continuous, powerful, and violent booming, a sound that shook the very foundations of the cabin. It was the sound of a battering ram against a castle door. It was the sound of the prison finally, catastrophically, failing. The sleeper was no longer testing the ice. It was breaking it. I stood at the picture window, my hand pressed against the cold glass, and watched. The beam from my spotlight on. The porch illuminated the scene in a stark, terrifying white light. The hole in the ice was no longer still. The black water within it was churning, boiling, as if from a great heat, though the air outside was still brutally cold. The epicenter of the booming sound was right there, in that dark, turbulent water. Then, I saw the cracks appear. They radiated outwards from the hole like black lightning, forking across the white expanse of the lake. With every deep, resonant boom, from below, the cracks would lengthen and widen, the sound of the fracturing ice a high, sharp scream against the low, powerful bass of the booming. The entire surface of the lake was becoming a fragile, shattered web. The cage was breaking, apart. My fear was so absolute that it had become a strange, detached calm. I was no longer a participant in this event. I was simply a witness to something ancient and vast, a geological, or perhaps metaphysical event that was unfolding before my eyes. My own small life, my novel, my anxieties. They were all meaningless in the face of this raw, primordial power. I was just a small, soft creature watching a mountain shrug. The booming intensified, and a great plume of black water erupted from the hole, showering the surrounding ice with a dark, freezing rain. The sound was now a continuous, deafening roar, the sound of a war being waged between the ancient prisoner and its icy cage. The entire lake seemed to tremble, and I could feel the vibrations resonating in my own chest. A deep, sickening thrum that matched the frantic beating of my heart. And in the churning black water, in the heart of the geyser, I saw it. It was not a clear shape. It was not a monster from a movie. It was something far more terrifying in its vagueness. It was a glimpse of something impossibly large and impossibly pale. A vast, white, boneless shape turning over on itself in the dark water. A form that seemed to suck the light from my spotlight. A creature whose biology was a profound and terrifying contradiction. It was there for only a second. A fleeting image, of immense pale flesh, before it sank back into the churning depths. But the image was burned into my mind. It was a thing that should not exist, a creature from a world without light, a being whose very presence was a violation of every law of nature I had ever known. The sleeper was not a spirit. It was a physical thing, and it was vast. The ice gave way. With a final, deafening crack that echoed across the entire valley, a huge section of the lake around the hole collapsed inward, creating a massive, dark pool of open, turbulent water. Great shards of ice, some as large as cars, were tossed into the air before crashing back down into the blackness. The prison was breached. The sleeper was free. I watched as the churning of the water began to move, to travel away from the shore, out towards the center of the newly formed pool. The entity was not interested in my small cabin. I had been right. I was insignificant, a footnote. Its escape was the only thing that mattered. It was moving out into its newly liberated territory, its ancient kingdom, now free from its icy ceiling for the first time in a century. I stood at that window for hours, long after the violent eruption had subsided into a quiet, lapping stillness. I just watched the new dark open water under the moonlight. The silence that returned was the silence of a great and terrible freedom. The prisoner was free, and the world, which had been safe in its dormancy, was now a much older and much more dangerous place. My part in the story was over. All that was left was the escape. I packed a single bag that night, my movements slow and dreamlike. The terror had been so immense, so absolute, that it had burned itself out, leaving behind only a hollow, echoing calm. I took my laptop, my logbook, and nothing else. The rest of the cabin, my clothes, my books, my half-finished novel, they belonged to this place now. They were offerings to the silent, watching lake, a small price to pay for my own escape. I did not look back as I walked away. I drove until the sun came up, my car eating up the miles, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Blackwood Lake. I did not call the police. I did not call my friends. What could I possibly tell them? That the lake had given birth to a god or a monster? That I had witnessed a geological horror story come to life? They had already diagnosed me with cabin fever. The truth would have me committed. My story died with the winter night. I abandoned my old life. I could no longer write. The fictional worlds I created seemed fragile and meaningless compared to the terrifying, deep reality I had brushed up against. The silence I had once craved was now my greatest enemy, a canvas onto which my memory would paint the image of the churning water and the vast, pale shape within it. I needed noise. I needed crowds. I needed the constant, chaotic hum of humanity to drown out the memory of the thumping. I moved to a small apartment in a city in the desert. It is the flattest, driest, most landlocked place I could find. There are no deep lakes here, no ancient woods, no profound, heavy silence. The air is always warm and dry. My window looks out onto a landscape of sand, rock, and concrete. I have surrounded myself with a geography that is the polar opposite of that winter cabin. It is my new, desperate attempt at a fortress. Life is different now. I work as a technical writer, a job that is blessedly devoid of imagination. My world is one of manuals and instructions, of clear, logical steps. I sleep with a fan on every night, not for the coolness, but for the noise. The constant, mechanical whirring is a shield against the silence. It is a guard at the door of my mind, keeping the memories of the deep, rhythmic thumping at bay. I'm safe here. I have to believe that. The entity was a thing of the water, a creature of the deep, cold north. It was trapped by the ice, and now it is free in its lake. It has its kingdom back. It has no reason to concern itself with the small, terrified mammal that watched its birth from the shore. I was a coincidence, an insignificant witness to an event that was a century in the making. It has forgotten me, but sometimes, on the quietest nights, when the wind dies down and the city outside holds its breath, I feel a tremor of the old fear. I will find myself listening, my ears straining, for a sound that should not be able to reach me here, 1,000 miles away, in the heart of the desert. It is a foolish, paranoid reflex, the lingering symptom of a trauma that is now years in the past. It is just a memory. But a memory cannot make the floorboards vibrate. A memory cannot be a slow, patient, and rhythmic beat that seems to be coming from deep within the dry, parched earth beneath my building. A memory cannot be a sound that is so faint, I almost convince myself I am imagining it, but so deep, I can feel it in the soles of my feet. It is a familiar sound, a sound of something testing its prison. I lie in my bed now, in my safe desert city, and I listen. Thump. 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 It is very far away, deep in the bedrock of the continent, but it is there, and I finally understand. The lake was not its prison. The ice was not its cage. They were just the last place it had been sleeping. It is much older, much vaster than I ever imagined, and it is a slow, patient, and tireless traveler. It has not forgotten me. It has followed me, and I know that one day, perhaps years from now, in this dry and waterless land, the thumping will stop being a distant echo and become a sound that is right beneath my feet. The sleeper is not a creature of the water. It is a creature of the deep places of the world, and it is still coming for me.